Pittsburgh. And so for over a decade now, we at the Forum have brought trailblazers in philanthropy to this campus. And we've asked them to take us inside their works in progress, the institutional challenges they face, and the very candid views they've brought us of this field. Many were authors, and I've seen familiar faces here, so you've seen the cavalcade of stars we've brought to this stage over that time. Others were eminent scholars. All were breaking new ground when they came to Pitt to visit with us. But I have to say that none of them has kindled the level of intensive soul searching in this field that Edgar Villanueva has sparked with his recent book, Decolonizing Wealth, Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and Restore Balance. From its first paragraphs right on through its conclusion, the book upends the mythology and benevolence of philanthropy. It likens philanthropy's roots, norms, and harms to colonialism. It's a call to self-awareness and to universal healing. And in that call, our speaker pinpoints the need to liberate philanthropy from its perpetuation of harm and to return to its core tenets of love, healing, and common purpose. That restoration, however, cannot happen without unpacking, acknowledging, and redressing difficult truths, he contends. Many of those truths and some of the steps that he advises we take together will be covered today. But above all, he asks us to think of money differently, not as a source of oppression or pain, but instead, he asks us to treat money like medicine, a balm and a tonic administered where the hurt is the greatest by people who understand the source of and the solutions for this pain most authentically. Edgar, it's a powerful call to action. And for a field where politeness reigns and much that is difficult remains unspoken, these ideas have hit the central nervous system of philanthropy. And so I thank you for that too. Today we have a rare opportunity to speak with Edgar Villanueva about money as medicine and where we need to go to move forward. Edgar is an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe. He's worked at 2 major foundations. He serves as chair of the board of directors of Native Americans in Philanthropy in the NDN Collective and is a board member of the Andrus Fund, a national foundation that works to improve outcomes for vulnerable youth. Edgar currently serves as Vice President of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation for Public Education, where he oversees grant investment and capacity building supports for education and social justice programs in the United States. He holds 2 degrees from the Gilling School of Global Public Health at the University of North Carolina and Chapel Hill. And thanks to our partners at Grantmakers of Western Pennsylvania, Barb Taylor and Jenny Nielsen and the entire team there, Edgar has just come from addressing the annual meeting of Grantmakers of Western Pennsylvania. And we're so fortunate to have him with us here today. He's going to open up our conversation by sharing some of the thoughts about the colonial dynamics in philanthropy and some steps to decolonize wealth. We'll move into a conversation then together with Edgar, he and I, and then we'll ask Joylette Partlock, who is the executive director of Sustainable Pittsburgh, to really anchor the conversation and Edgar's remarks in some local context. Joylette Partlock is the first executive director of Sustainable Pittsburgh in 2 decades, and there she is leading some of the most exciting work in our community on thinking about assets and the intersection of the built environment, business, and other natural resources that we have in our community. Joylette will offer 3 to 4 minutes of ideas inspired by Edgar's comments, and then we'll turn to your questions, which I know will lead to a lively exchange. I am sorry to say that Michelle McMurray from the Pittsburgh Foundation, who was scheduled to also join Joylette on this stage, is not able to be with us today because of a family emergency. And that's a particular shame because it was she who brought us so much of the insight about Edgar's work, but we'll have another opportunity for her to connect with Edgar in the coming days. So with that said, and with those ground rules, I'd like to turn to Edgar now and invite you to give us a few moments of thoughts about colonialism in philanthropy, how you see it, and what we need to do about it. Edgar, welcome to Pittsburgh.
Thanks, you guys. I'm really honored to be here. That was a beautiful, beautiful introduction. Kathy, thank you. I really appreciate it. So just a little bit about who my people are, where I come from, that may provide some context to my worldview about this work. Kathy mentioned I'm from the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. We are a tribe situated in southeastern North Carolina, and we have about 60,000 enrolled members. We are the largest tribe east of the Mississippi River. So we're kind of big, we're proud of it. And we are also a community that was the very first point of contact for European settlers in this country. And so my people have been exposed to colonization, to whiteness, however you want to think about it, for a long, long time. And there are different implications to that, like we no longer have a language. But what's amazing to see is the resilience of the culture that remains after many, 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 many years of exposure to colonization. So my people are Native American, my people are Southern, my people are Black, Brown, and Indigenous freedom fighters in the South. My people are poor, they are country, they are domestic workers. They are people who are really pushing and fighting to break the cycle of poverty and violence that has sort of plagued our communities and our family for a long time. I grew up with a single mother who was a domestic worker and was just a fabulous person. If you read the book, it's very clear I am like the biggest mama's boy of all time. And my mom, there was just so many things that she impressed upon me, and beyond sort of our worldview and our culture and our beliefs and values, a commitment to community and service and to taking care of people. You know, when someone needed help or support, we were there to share love and to share light in the community. And so I also come from a family and a background that was very deeply embedded in the faith community and the Christian faith. And so the Christian church had a lot of impressions on me early on and sort of how I viewed the world, for better or worse in some cases, and sort of the path that I chose early in life in terms of where I wanted to make a difference in the world. So those are things that brought me to where I am today. And about 15 years ago, I stumbled into a job at a foundation, which if you ask anybody who works at a foundation, that's kind of our universal response. Mm-hmm. We stumbled into these jobs. Nowadays, you can get your degree in philanthropy, and there's different ways to enter the field. But I was 28 years old, finishing my master's at Chapel Hill. Have been working at this national nonprofit doing advocacy work around health equity issues. And I got recruited by this foundation in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I was like, one, I don't want to live in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I'm ready to move to the big city, so no. Two, I went to interview at the push of a professor, and it was a staff of like 8 people, and it was in this little house, and it just all seemed strange. And I was like, that's not where I see myself. I'm going to work for Mayo Clinic or I don't know. So anyway, after several conversations at this foundation, I began to understand wow, this is an opportunity. I think the foundation at that time was $550 million, and I would have a portfolio of 25 million. So I was like, so you're telling me I would make decisions over millions of dollars of where to give it around the state of North Carolina? They're like, yeah, pretty much. So I was like, okay. So I took the job, And, after a number of years in this sector, I began to feel some frustration and kind of started bumping up into different tensions that were really mind-boggling for me, because I'm like, we have this mission of helping poor people, and we explicitly say that we should be supporting the poorest counties in North Carolina. However, we're not moving any grants to those communities. And why is it that when we convene our grantees, it's like all white men? And why is our board all white men? And so, long story short, I was told to be quiet. That was too big for my britches. I shouldn't be asking these questions. I should keep my head down and do my job. And I really began to feel some disillusion around what this world really was and what this work was about. There was a disconnect between sort of what we said we were about and what we were actually doing. And when I began to really, in an innocent way, as a young person, ask questions around what was happening with a real sincere desire to learn, that was seen as very, very threatening. And ultimately, I was shown the door of this organization. And in my own sort of licking my wounds and trying to figure out, my own healing from, it was a painful experience, I found there were so many who had the same story as me. Women, people of color, LGBT folks, anybody from, folks from marginalized communities, often were pushed out of organizations or oppressed inside philanthropic organizations, if they were trying to make change. And so I was grappling with this idea, like, is philanthropy really about changing communities? Or are we really about concentrating wealth and accumulating more wealth and having legacy for corporations and families and wealthy folks? And as I began asking these questions, this was really around the time I went to a second job at a foundation that was very progressive. We talked about race, we talked about power, but some of the dynamics were still there under the surface. It was a place where you were not allowed to shine as a leader. You kind of kept your nose down and did your job. We were told that it's a privilege to work here. If you don't want to work here, there's a million people who would take your place. And they weren't wrong about that, After I left that job and moved to New York, I had this story that I felt like I needed to tell. I had started collecting stories from folks who had really tried to be agents of change within philanthropy, and they met extreme resistance. So I began to unravel, why is it that we, a sector that is supposed to be about community change and progress and doing good, why is it that we actually, it's actually hard for us to do that? When we're talking this language of diversity, equity, inclusion, why is it actually hard to do that work? Why is it that we fund $60 billion a year in grants, but only 7.5% of that goes to communities of color, right? So I wanted to get to a deeper, more raw conversation about these underlying challenges in our sector. And then that led me on a whole personal journey, actually, of personal healing. At the same time, I was really trying to reconnect deeply with my indigenous heritage and culture. I had ran a Native nonprofit, and I because I didn't grow up in my Native community, I grew up in the city, I was feeling a sense of disconnection. And as I spent time back home in the community talking with elders, I started having wisdom imparted to me about the type of leader I should be, what philanthropy really means from an indigenous point of view, what being a good community member or a good relative actually meant. And I began to think, this is really simple. This is really simple. The work of being a good funder or a good leader or a good advocate in communities really is simple, and I think we've lost our way in philanthropy. And long story short, because you got to read the book, I can't tell you in 5 seconds, and I want to get into this conversation here with Kathy. I began to zoom out and just examine what was happening more broadly in this country, and as we are seeing acts of hate and terrorism and white supremacy. And I began to understand that we are a country that our economic system is based off of extraction, right? Our history has so many original sins like genocide and slavery and stolen land. And the accumulation of wealth actually historically is steeped with trauma, right? And it's a history that we have not grappled with. It's a history that we as philanthropy are inherently connected to and have perpetuated that trauma sometimes on communities. And it was something that if we're gonna be really serious about change in communities, if we're really gonna be really serious about walking the walk of equity and inclusion, we were gonna have to come to terms with that history and have our own process of truth and reconciliation and our own processes of healing in order to show up and actually be in right relationship with the community. And so these are some of the questions that I examined and had the opportunity to interview and talk to all types of fascinating folks while I was forming my own analysis and looking for my own healing. And so I packaged that up in a little book that I offer to you all today. And I'm looking forward to just jumping in with you and talking more about it.
Super, thanks. Well, in this book, you provide a really powerful and vivid framework of trauma from colonial behavior within philanthropy. And you give us a number of examples in the book. Are there certain elements of this colonial framework that are more toxic within philanthropy than others? Would there be one or two that you'd call out that need special attention and redress?
Yeah, I mean, it's really about getting to the tough questions that often are not examined. When we look at philanthropic practice, we often think of reforms that we need around grant-making practices, and we should be making general operating support grants or thinking about impact and metrics and things in a different way. All of those reforms are certainly valid, but what we often don't do is dig a little bit deeper and ask questions around where did the wealth come in the first place? Who might have been harmed historically through how wealth was accumulated that sits in these foundations? Who gets to manage, allocate, control, and spend the money? Who's benefiting from this wealth? And and so those are the deeper questions that start kind of tapping into power, into history, and where we start getting a little bit uncomfortable. And so that's where I see sort of the colonial dynamics. Colonial dynamics, in short, I kind of think of the history of colonization. What it has resulted in for all of us is trauma, yes, but there's also dynamics of separation, division, the creating of the haves and the have-nots, and sort of maintaining power in a concentrated group of people. We see that playing out in philanthropy when we look at who gets to start foundations in the first place, who gets to sit at the top and call the shots about where funding should go and where the funds are actually going, who's on the receiving end of those funds. Across the board, we have a major diversity problem, right? And so, and then we have, some might say a democracy issue there, right? When you think about the $900 billion in philanthropic capital that would have gone into the tax system through our democratic process and been allocated to support safety net and public education, senior care, all of those services, but yet we have this system in the U.S. that allows for wealthy individuals or corporations to start foundations, which therefore make them richer, right? And then they fund more folks who have resources than folks who don't have resources. We have to ask the question, are we perpetuating this dynamic of them versus us, or the haves versus the have-nots?
But philanthropy thinks of itself as a source of good in society. And so how's this message gone over as you've been not only talking in the media, but having what you said earlier today were 130 such lectures and encounters with the public? What's the reaction been to this message?
It's been great, actually, because I think that we are living in a time, unfortunately, where even people with wealth and privilege and power feel the anxiety of the times we're living in. No one is safe from the craziness that is happening all around us. And in days gone by, there were certain folks with privilege and money who maybe felt unaffected by political activity. But we are living in times where even those folks are feeling compelled to do something different to get this country back on track and reunited as much as we can, because we are completely torn apart. The message has really been received well, and I think a couple reasons why, Kathy. One, I'm sharing personal narrative in the book about what my experience has been like as a person of color working for 15 years in these three major institutions. So when you're telling your personal story, it's irrefutable. No one can, no one can argue with my personal experience because it is what it is. There's data that I weave into the storytelling around it is what it is. These are the facts. This is how much money we have in this sector. This is where money is going and where money isn't going. And we should, from a justice perspective, actually be very ashamed of that. I think it's unacceptable when you think of the history that people of color have played in building wealth in this country, which led to the building of these philanthropic institutions. And now we benefit so small from the resources. And so that's data that is a fact that we can't argue with. And then finally, I would say that we're a super polite industry. So in that case, that serves me well as a book that came out that's subject to critique. That if people don't like it, they tend to be quiet about it. So, but I don't think that. I think that we're really just in a place where folks are really hungry for truth and hungry for answers and really wanted to get beyond the surface. I keep dropping this, I'm sorry. I move a lot when I talk, I was telling you. There we go.
We're good.
Okay.
Can you hear?
And so, I think that it speaks to the response to this book, the response to how my travel schedule and how I've been out there is really reflective on folks really wanting to open their minds and heart to some real change and the responsibility that we have as stewards of these resources. And it's not been all in progressive bubbles. I've been in all over more conservative spaces in corporate America, in places that you might be surprised having this conversation, because I just think we're all feeling a need to step up in this moment to see change and in our communities.
Super. In the book, you talk about 7 steps that we can walk together to move through acknowledgement, to redress, to healing. Do they have to be done, all 7 steps, in a sequence, or can they be done out of kilter with jumping to the end, money as medicine, without the acknowledgement of harm and seeking to apologize?
No, there's nothing linear about the steps, and the only reason that there are 7 steps is because my editor made me have 7 steps, because it's a book, you got to have like a catchy thing. There's nothing linear in like Indian Native American culture. We're very circular, and so just a little bit more background about that in case you haven't had a chance to read the book. So in the first half of the book, I talk about where it hurts. I talk about our history of colonization, slavery, and genocide, and these original sins of our country that have resulted in so much trauma, and how wealth accumulation is embedded and connected to all of those things, and how we have to come to terms with that painful past in order to have a future where we are able to begin a collective healing process. So in the second half of the book, I lay out a path to healing that's deeply connected to indigenous teachings and wisdom that have you heard of restorative justice, right? So it's very connected to a restorative justice model which comes out of indigenous communities. And it starts with really a process of truth and understanding and knowing the truth, which will cause you to grieve. So the very first step to healing is grieving. So if you feel a little sad today about some of the things I'm saying, then you are well on your way to healing, right? Because when we acknowledge the truth of what has transpired in this country, when we acknowledge the truth of how we and some of our institutions have not done right by community and we potentially have harmed community, when we acknowledge how even in our own family's history there are things that we might be ashamed of, we're going to feel sad about it. We're going to feel a heaviness about it, which is completely normal and human, and that's how we should feel. And that grief is what is going to compel us to move forward to make change. Other steps in the cycle include actually apologizing, listening, relating, building authentic relationships, investing and repairing. I won't go through all 7 of them, but they are not linear. It is a circular and process. And you all know it's very, if you've ever experienced loss or trauma in your life, your path to healing from that could be, there's no linear path, right? You may feel that you've made progress, and then here comes the grief again, right? And sometimes you're not in the position to apologize or to receive an apology. And so it is very circular, but these are steps that we all can take in our lives as individuals, and there are steps that we can take as institutions, and there are steps that I think we can take actually as a country to have truth and reconciliation and to get on a path of healing. And we talk about in the book how money can be used to help facilitate and support that process.
I wonder if we could spend a few minutes just talking about wealth in the way you dimensionalize it for us in the book. I mean, you talk about it from different angles, how it was gotten, so that's the framework of exploitation, how it's stored, and then how it's given and to whom with whom it's shared. So maybe just unpacking those and taking that first element, how it was gotten. You talk about a number of ways that the assets foundations use today were gotten from indigenous people through exploitative means, and that's where the harm actually occurred. And you talk about the fact that the same money was stolen twice. Can you talk about what that means? Stolen twice?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, you all know the history of this country and our economic system. I mean, at one point in time, slavery was the economic driver. And so when you think about that, when you think about genocide and the land that was taken from Native Americans, when you think about how literally bodies of indigenous folks and black folks in this country had price tags on them, that we literally were a product and bought and sold the economic system of this country, and in our founding is inherently connected to exploitation and the harming of people and of the planet. And so that's a basis where we're starting from. Now I get this question all the time. Well, I work in tech and my family made their money off of this app or whatever, so we didn't hurt anybody. Well, what you have to do in those cases is we all have to trace back and look at, from those acts of violence there to present day. There have been numerous policies down through time that have privileged and really helped to concentrate wealth with certain folks, white folks, and that have oppressed and stripped wealth on an ongoing basis from people of color. So although in your recent memory, maybe your family did not own slaves, but you have to recognize that there have been policies like the GI Bill, for example, right, that may have set your family up in a position to benefit and work towards wealth, and that is a bill that my family would not, as domestic workers, would not have been in a position to benefit from. And so that's sort of something that it's really important to understand that throughout history, from the time of colonization, historical colonization, because it's still happening, genocide, slavery, all of these things to present day, there have been actual explicit violence that have happened on the backs of people of color to build wealth. And then there have been more subtle, at times, policies, or actually very explicit racist policies that have served to create wealth with a certain group of people, namely white people. And so that's something that we, as now holders of wealth, is a history that we have to grapple with and understand that, it's not our fault. We in this room didn't make those decisions back then, right? But we are now sitting at the table and making decisions, if you're a funder in the room, about where resources are going, and making decisions about programs and strategies in this community about how to allocate assets. And that historical context is extremely important to understand. Otherwise, this is why people say, well, why don't they just pull themselves up by the bootstraps? And if Native Americans would just stop drinking, if these kids would just get a job, right? It's so easy to reduce trauma down to those types of services and to stereotype, with a blanket over whole communities if we don't take into account the historical and systemic racism and trauma that folks are grappling with in these communities.
Are you calling on foundations who might have gotten their wealth from extractive industries to divest from those industries now. We have some examples of people who are pulling out of fossil fuels. For example, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, for example, which made its wealth in that particular, the petrochemical industry, has called for divestment of their own portfolio. Are you asking for that sort of redress from funders?
Yeah, and not just for foundations to divest from particular industries that help them generate wealth, but from all industries that are harmful and extractive. So you all may know that I mentioned there's $900 billion in philanthropic capital. The majority of that, about 95%, is invested in Wall Street. It never even leaves the door and gets to the community, right? And of that 95%, the majority, more than 80% of those investments are in harmful and extractive industries like private prisons, like fossil fuels. And so what we have on a very regular basis are foundations who fund community intervention programs on one hand, but are invested in harmful portfolios that actually cancel out the value of the good they're trying to do, right? So that makes no sense to me, and it's something, sort of a campaign that I've been a part of, is to really push foundations to see their investments and their endowments not as like private wealth, where I'm going to like build wealth and make some nice grants on the side, but this is all wealth that should be deployed to for social progress and for good. And so at minimum in investment portfolios, we can look at investing in products that at least do no harm to communities, but there's also lots of opportunities to invest in things like mission-related investments and program-related investments, which many of you may know about, to actually help accelerate progress in communities.
When we were reading the book, I think we couldn't help but reflect on how some of the major foundations in this community have accumulated their wealth from some of the same industries that today you might consider to be negative or damaging to people and to the environment. Is there something you're asking a region like ours to consider doing collectively, or are you thinking that more of this action will come at the individual foundation level initially?
I think it would be beautiful if folks could do that as a region, and it might be possible that somewhere here where there is a close-knit philanthropic community, that would be something that folks would want to take on. But that might be challenging, I mean, foundations that's like asking a bunch of wealthy families to get together and talk about their money with each other, right? And it's sort of a hush-hush kind of private thing. So I think it starts at home. I think before you jump into those kind of deep conversations with others, it is really having a conversation at your institution to know, we have our history on our website, we know the wealth was made in this way, and that our founders were charitable people and did all these great things, but also what may have transpired that harmed folks, and can we be honest about that history? And in our well-intentioned work, who have we potentially harmed in building of the wealth, but also now in our philanthropic practice, right? And so there are foundations that have taken that to heart. I mentioned earlier today, the Northwest Area Foundation, for example, in Minneapolis, made their money from building railroads from Minneapolis to the West Coast, and in doing so, harmed 8 Native nations. I don't even know the particulars of how. Maybe they built a railroad right through their community, or now, as a form of reparations, they have a portfolio at this foundation that specifically focuses on investing in those communities and building Native nations. So I think that's a direct response to taking ownership of, we did something wrong here, or something harmful happened to communities in our wealth accumulation that we want to try to make right. And we can't undo what's happened, right? We can't undo 500 years of colonization, but we can examine our practices and how we're showing up, and be self-aware around if we are harming folks, or if we've harmed folks historically, and try to right those wrongs.
You helped us think about the investment, the 95% of assets you talked about, impact investing as one way to focus on not the 5% of grant making, but the assets that fuel the grants and whether more of that can be put into productive use to redress some of the issues that you describe so compellingly. But the other piece of wealth is how it's given. And I wonder if you could talk about ways that funders can be more inclusive and to bring in people with the solutions from communities of color. Are you suggesting they restaff and retool their boards, or are there additional mechanisms that you might suggest that we all use?
I mean, there are change opportunities across the board. There are choice points that organizations can make, starting with the board, right? And so we know that 89% of boards are white of foundations, and so we have lots of opportunity. There's nowhere to go but up when it comes to diversifying boards. And even family foundation boards, right? So historically, those boards are like just family, this is our family thing. There's a trend now where more family foundations are bringing non-family onto their board, with acknowledging that, you know what, these are resources that our family decided to put into this container, but these are resources and wealth that should belong to the community. And who are we to make all the decisions, because we're a group of privileged people. And so it's totally legal and okay for family foundations to bring non-family members to their board. I recently joined a family foundation board who for the first time brought on 3 community members, and the family is still intact. They're still a family. We did not disrupt any family, you know, and everybody's good, and it's awesome. I'm learning from them, they're learning from me. And so definitely around governance, I actually propose in the book that I think there should be legislation on foundations to mandate diversity of boards. If you look at many institutions that get federal funding, like a federally qualified health center, those institutions are required to have 51% of their board be patients of that clinic, to be users of that resource. And so if we're getting huge tax write-offs for foundations, I think that we could actually think about some requirements or guidelines on foundations that would actually require. We're not getting there fast enough by making the decisions ourselves, so I'm all about some external pressure to push that. And we all know that boards of foundations, I mean, it's who's running foundations and who sits on the board. There's an equal, like, dotted line correlation, like right here, to who gets the money. And the reason that mostly white-led organizations get funding is because we have mostly white-led organizations providing the funding. When you see diversity happening with institutions, you automatically see a shift in the grant making. And so around grant making, absolutely, we love data and philanthropy. Let's look at the data, like collect data on the leadership and the demographics of your grantees, who is benefiting from that funding, and then do some analysis around that. If you are, you look at your grant making and you see that you're only investing, 5% of your grants in like people of color-led organizations, that's kind of sad, like change that. And that requires building new relationships, diversifying your staff perhaps internally. But sometimes it also means just like handing the money over, right? And I think this is where we really get into some power conversations. I propose in the book that foundations should just hand over capital to communities of color. And if we're gonna build wealth in communities of color, sprinkling around some like innovative, nice grants along the way is not gonna get us there fast enough. The world is ending in 12 years or 10 years or whatever these climate justice reports say. And
we'll
so
come back to that.
I feel a sense of urgency to act now, right? So there are many, many people of color-led funds and initiatives out there that are focused on building wealth in communities of color that foundations could actually take a chunk of their money and just hand it over and trust them and say, you know what? We want to be your allies and your partners, but we also want to just let you do this work because this is your community, and we're sorry that you haven't had access to these resources in the past, but now you do. Mm-hmm. And so that is actually happening as well. I actually say in the book that foundations should take 10% of their endowments and just hand them over to communities of color. I put a little bit more meat on the bones in the book, but that's basically what I'm saying. A foundation in Toronto came to me, the CEO said, we read your book and that thing about the 10%, and we're doing that. We're taking 10% of our endowment and we're giving it to First Nations people. I was like, what? I didn't know if anyone would actually do it, But I just kind of pulled 10% out of the air to create a conversation or an imagination around what's possible if we actually start moving capital into communities. We cannot hold some of these institutions or organizations led by people of color to these same standards sometimes that we have for these large white-led institutions who have been privileged by philanthropy for 70 years, and then to say, well, oh, this one doesn't have the capacity. There's a reason that they may not get the same score on your rubric because they have been underinvested in and marginalized for 70 years. And so we need to sort of account for that by changing our mindsets and our measurements and our risk, however we see risk, and build trust, but just also turn capital over. And there's ways to figure out how to do that.
I think one of the most interesting ideas in the book is related to this point you just made about turning it over. And maybe that's part of what you meant when you talk about treating money as medicine. Can you share some more about that? Because I think the book spends so much time thinking about the harms that money has done or wealth accumulation has done. But the idea of medicine, can you talk about where that comes from and what that might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. One more point about where we were. I think to get to a place where you can even imagine giving money back, which is funny. I was with a circle of billionaires recently having this conversation, and I hadn't even gotten up to speak yet, and someone mentioned like, oh yeah, it's a good thing that we're giving back, and someone was really triggered by the idea of giving back. Because giving back implied that they had taken something in the first place, right? So if we're going to get to a point where we think about sort of turning capital over or giving back capital, we do have to get to a place to understand or believe or imagine that, the history of taking that has actually occurred, in order to begin to imagine like giving money back, that it's not actually ours. This is money that belongs to the community. That's been twice stolen, once from our history and then second from the tax system of not paying taxes on it. But to transition to this idea of money being medicine, one, into the indigenous worldview, what medicine is anything for us that restores balance, that sort of makes us feel complete or good. So it's not like literal Tylenol or penicillin, right? It's like, I feel off, so maybe I need to go on a hike because I'm going to get a clarity of mind and shake off a bad day and feel better, right? So taking that hike is medicine. And so anything for us in the indigenous worldview can be medicine if we allow our intuition and if we sort of anoint something to be medicine. So I bring that concept into this book, which on the surface sounds really like provocative, that money can be medicine. How so if money is such this terrible thing that's like, done all these crazy things? One, there's the premise that money is actually a neutral thing, right? It's not the money's fault. Money is a proxy for relationships. Money is something that we created as people. We out of thin air for a complex society. And so it's not the money's fault that all these terrible things have happened. It's we as humans who have, perpetuated these colonial dynamics, and our greed and our fear and our scarcity mindsets have hoarded wealth, right? And so the case that I'm making in the book is that we can flip that. If sort of the accumulation of wealth has resulted in trauma, can wealth actually help be medicine to heal that trauma, to help facilitate healing for that trauma? And my premise is yes, if we move money to where the hurt is the worst, then we can use these resources as a type of medicine to restore balance. And we know where the hurt is the worst economically is in communities of color. And so as philanthropists who have the opportunity to use our money for good, we should be putting, huge percentages of our money in communities of color, not just 7.5%. So currently we are not using our resources as medicine, but I think we have the opportunity. If every time you sit down and you ran a grant proposal, you're making a recommendation to your board, if you ask yourself, am I using this money for medicine? Is this money going to help heal some trauma or help restore wealth in a community of color that has been marginalized? Then you might be making a good grant.
Great. You know, we're in a time of incivility. You talked about that just a few minutes ago, and that's true in our public and in our political discourse. And you're calling on us to have what are difficult conversations, to acknowledge some of the things that are part of a colonial past, and to give up some of the control and the power that's involved in how that money gets taken and given for productive use. Is there something about the current climate that gives you hope that we can have those conversations, or do you think this is just going to be one more prolonged either difficulty or silence? You know, something we do, we check the box, we have the dialogue, but then we don't change practices. What about the moment we're in the incivility of it?
No, I feel like we're in a moment like everyone's talking about race, right? And unfortunately, a lot of that conversation is sparked by the horrific acts of white supremacy that we've seen, that I know for me as a young man, had never imagined in my lifetime that I would see such like raw, explicit acts, right, of white nationalism. Although we know that those demons are always at work, but I think that because of what has transpired in this country over the past couple of years, we are in a special moment that something's got to give. Like we are not going in the right direction. And more and more people are standing up for racial justice and saying that this is not acceptable. This is not the community we want to be. And the only way forward to get to that place, to begin that work, is a process of truth and reconciliation. We are the only quote unquote civilized country, I hate to use that term, but country that has not had a process of truth and reconciliation. They had one in Germany. They've, you know, in terms of what happened in World War II. They've had South Africa. They have Canada. And so we, I think, as a country, are not going to get beyond like these racial tensions that we have here until we actually put this truth on the table. Because not only are we wanting to sweep the truth under the carpet, we are like trying to erase the truth and teach something different to our kids, and like completely erase you know, certain groups of people and certain events that are a real part of our history and have implications for present day communities. And so I think that we are in a moment, I feel very hopeful about a process of truth and reconciliation. They have, the state of Maine had a process of truth and reconciliation, which is, I mentioned to someone, there's an awesome documentary called Dawnland that like chronicles that process in Maine. And it's very painful. It's not fun. No one wants to like, you know, sit around and bring up all this painful crap. But it's what we have to do to like really document and verify the experiences that people have suffered. We have never had an official apology for slavery in this country. We have never had an official apology from the government for every single broken treaty made to Native American people. And we continue to harm. We continue to roll out policies that are erasing, extracting, and exploiting people of color in this country. And so we've got to pull the brake on that. We've got to find a way to acknowledge what has happened and to stop more harm from happening to communities. And I think it's now or never. If we don't find a way to start having these conversations that are uncomfortable, beginning in our homes, right, beginning in our communities, then I don't see any other way forward. And I think that the nonprofit sector, I know a lot of you are nonprofit leaders, the philanthropic sector, we have such an awesome role to play to help begin creating spaces for those conversations and modeling those conversations and holding the mirror up and maybe taking ownership for where we haven't shown up right by community and trying to rectify and reconcile some of that. You see it happening in faith communities. We have churches that are denouncing the doctrine of discovery, that are apologizing for what they've done around like Indian boarding schools and all of these things. So I'm hopeful. I think that we all want healing in our communities, and not just healing for people of color and indigenous folks, but healing for white people who are also suffering because of white supremacy. Like this crazy ideology is harming all of us, and so if we can name that and consider the different ways that it's harmed us, then maybe we can begin a collective healing process together.
Great. I wonder if we could turn to Joylette now. I mean, there's so much more for me to ask you, but I really want Joylette to share with us some of your reflections, hearing Edgar talk and in the context of the work you're doing here with Sustainable Pittsburgh.
Right. Well, thank you so much, too, for inviting me to be here and part of this conversation. This is so big, and it's so important. So there's so much to say. I have my completely indecipherable Post-it notes. So I'll make an attempt here. So I'm the executive director of Sustainable Pittsburgh, and most people, when they hear the word sustainability, well, actually, people think of a whole bunch of different things. Sometimes they think of just financial sustainability for an organization or a corporation. Sometimes they think just of the environment piece, but holistic sustainability really does bring in social equity as one of the key pillars, right? Out of recognition that if you're building something to be sustainable, if you're building a community to last, you can't ignore social equity or the environment as part of how you do that. Those are critical features, bringing everybody into the chance for opportunity and preserving the space in which you exist are key points of that. And I think locally this room is, I'm guessing, relatively savvy in terms of some of these issues that we face locally, but we've seen recently report after report coming out talking about our major failings in terms of social equity, especially along racial lines. But there's also, as you pointed out, there are lots of communities with not a lot of people of color in them that have also been harmed by extractive industry over time. We are all living with kind of the environmental legacy of a lot of this. So these are really salient issues. And I know we spoke for a minute before the presentation about how every region has its own kind of story. Well, we have our own special story here when it comes to these things. My background is in science, in laboratory science, biology actually, and so I always think of this as who we are as a species, right? As a species, we are super adaptable, which is great, right? It's enabled us to thrive in just about every environment on the face of the planet. When it comes to adaptability, it's us and cockroaches, right? There's not, but everybody else is like far away, kudzu maybe, But this has a flip side, right? And the flip side of that ability to adapt and thrive in any environment is this ability to accept pretty much anything as normal, right? We are very good at accepting what should be or could be completely unacceptable situations as a baseline from which we operate and try to succeed. And so I want to thank you, Edgar, for bringing this conversation here and for your work everywhere to, have these uncomfortable conversations that kind of shake us out of that sense of normalcy and help us hold up that mirror to say, okay, what are we really looking at here? Because that space of being uncomfortable and questioning those assumptions, that's really where the change that we need to see happens. It doesn't happen around the edges. It happens when we take a look at the underlying structure of things and try to figure out how we reshape that. And I also want to thank you because in your first couple of sentences, you talked about where this work comes from for you personally, and I was thinking about the Fred Rogers quote, "Look for the helpers," right? And you're such a helper. I think that this holding up the mirror is really important, but I wasn't surprised when you responded to the question of, how has this been received in the philanthropic community, and that it's been received well. Because I do think that most people are looking for ways to be better and to do the right things. I think that we're all sort of, especially I would imagine when you start talking about the philanthropic community, this is the core value, right, of wanting to do the right thing. And certainly through the work that we do at Sustainable Pittsburgh, we work a lot in building communities and providing tools and resources to folks around sustainability in their organizations and local government, and figuring out ways to empower people to make better choices at the organizational level. And so I've seen firsthand so many times when it really is just a matter of having that conversation, providing those tools, generating that dialogue around the ideas that leads to change. We're very good at assuming that ignorance is malice, but that's not the case, right? I think there's a lot of space for us to do this work and to do it well. I think that this is a really interesting and potentially critical point when we start talking about having these difficult conversations. I feel like we are finally, culturally in many ways, getting to the point where we're having the right conversations at last. You mentioned a couple of examples. There's others. There's the Me Too movement. There's lots of things where we're finally starting to have what I feel like are the right conversations. And I think that comes from we do have better communications tools, so we can tell those stories more effectively. I think that it does also come from some amount of increase in representation, right? There's folks like you who have a platform. There's folks like me who are in positions to be starting to have these conversations in a real way. But these are all complicated topics, and I said we'd come back to climate. These are all complicated topics, and we don't have a lot of time to solve some of them. We've got some really impressive challenges before us. What gives me hope, continually renews my hope actually, is that we are, again, as a species, we do big things together. Right, we need to do them together, but we can do them together, and I can start to see, how we actually are marshaling our resources around some of these really critical structural issues in meaningful ways. These are complicated problems. If they were easy, they would have been solved long ago by an organization or a philanthropic entity, but they're not, and so we all have to have these conversations and have to figure out the way forward. I was chuckling to myself in my own mind as you were talking, thinking about our society as when I give talks, I often talk about how, talking about environmental sustainability. Earth is basically a closed system. We move resources around. We sometimes change how they look a little bit, but they're not going off the planet. Everything is still here with us. We're still connected to it. And in the same way, we're connected to each other, everybody in this room and everybody outside of it, we're all connected to each other. We all have a relationship to one another, whether we're cognizant of it in our day-to-day or not. And then, so I was chuckling to myself thinking about, well, how many times in your life have you ever had a relationship with someone, wronged them horribly, and then just ignored that, and it was okay? Any hands? Anybody ever? Just one in the back. I need to talk to you later. This is not. We are gonna have to grapple with this, and that's difficult because I think that does involve this process of being sad and grieving and forgiveness in some way, where forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean saying, oh, that doesn't matter, but accepting the reality of where we are. And so I just thought that was just a really interesting thing. Is like we're not going to be able to persist, I agree, with continuing with changing the story or ignoring the story of what's really happened. But I think we can do a better job from here of really grappling with these issues in a real way. So, yeah, thank you. I probably am over my 4 minutes.
But wonderfully so.
But if we have a couple more minutes, I'd love to hear maybe a deeper dive on issues of environmental justice specifically, and how not just the exploitation of people and labor over time have composed imbalances, but also how we've wrapping in that environment piece, and where a lot of our hardest hit communities of color still live. But I don't know.
You want to take?
I'll make one comment. I think I know that indigenous people around this planet are taking care of like 85% of the world's biodiversity, and we are so heavily reliant on these communities for the oxygen that we breathe. And, you know, and I appreciate that. And, you know, Standing Rock that happened a while ago, you all may know this whole fight around this oil pipeline. It was a moment for me that I was very proud of my community, and I got really politicized around the work that's happening in Native communities. But what really stood out for me there in a big way was like this Native community was not just fighting for their water and their land around that river and that place, but for the millions of people down the river, where if that oil got in that water, right, it's going to impact all of us. And sure enough, it's already been 2 years later, 2 years, there's already an oil spill that's terrible, and, you know, people saw it coming. So I just think that, you know, in Indigenous communities, when we say all my relations, we mean that we are literally connected to each other, but not just to human beings, but we're also connected and related to this earth. I was in Canada a while back, and there's an organization there working with environmental organizations that literally put an Indigenous person on the board of these environmental organizations who is a stand-in for Mother Earth. So like literally the planet has a seat on the board of the organization, right? Which is like kind of like a weird, interesting kind of thing to think about, but we have to hold this planet in that type of regard if we're going to save it. And so, I don't know, so those are just a couple of thoughts that, and it comes down to this whole separation-based thing that, again, is a byproduct of colonization. We don't see that we're connected to each other, and we don't see that we're connected to this earth, and that allows us to make decisions on a regular basis. You know, I was somewhere recently where I saw someone throw a bottle out of the window, like littering, and I was like dumbfounded. I'm like, people still do that? I remember when I was a kid occasionally seeing it before all the, like, what's it called, Save the Street kind of programs came up or whatever. And I mean, I literally felt like someone punched me in my gut to see like a plastic bottle being thrown out. And I was like, clearly this person has no connection at all to think that is, to this planet, to think that is okay. That bottle is not gonna end up, you know, in some like whatever terrible way harming this earth and ultimately them. And so we have to just shift our mind to understand that beyond just even our families, that we are inherently connected to each other and to this planet, and every decision that we make matters.
Wow. I wonder, that is just beautiful, that exchange right there, and I think it's a great segue to ask you if you have questions that you'd like to raise. Anne-Marie Tuckett is going to bring the microphone around if you want to raise your hand if you have a question.
Hello.
Hi, my name is Claire. Thank you very much. It's been enlightening to hear you and to hear your simplicity. It's been really lovely. Thank you. And at one point, in answer to a question, you said there were two takings. You raised the question, and you got to the first taking, and then later on, very quickly, you said what the second taking is, and it sparked me. The second taking is not paying taxes, you said, on the wealth. And I thought, I have never heard anybody say that before. And I'm 82, like I've heard a lot of people say a lot of things. So I wish you would talk more about that, because that, as a statement of, yes, we do belong to the whole community. Yes, we have a sense of morality. Yes, we do appreciate the truth of what we have taken, is such a strong statement. I mean, I'd like to get to truth and reconciliation, all kinds of other things, but this one is really a spark. Could you talk more about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, no one has ever become poor by starting a foundation, right? Because wealth managers are now advising folks to start foundations to make more money. And so is the philanthropy industry about supporting nonprofits, or is it about wealth preservation and growing wealth? And you know, what's even more alarming right now, which we haven't talked about today, are donor advised funds, right? And so Fidelity Charitable now is the largest holder of charitable assets, and they're not subject to the 5% payout rule, so you don't have to pay out anything. So all this money that would have gone into taxation can go into a donor advised fund and sit there for eternity and never even see the light of day. So I think that we really need to, it's a mind shift of actually seeing philanthropy not as a way to build wealth, but as a way to support changing communities. And I definitely think that we need to pay taxes. Everyone should pay taxes. I said earlier today, my favorite new analogy is that if Bruce Wayne would have paid more taxes, we would have needed less Batman, right? And so we have this thing where we don't want to pay, we want to live a certain lifestyle, but we also want to be the savior of the people that we're holding these resources from, which is like a weird identity crisis, right? So it is, I don't fault people for starting foundations because it's legal. We have a legal system that allows that. Most wealthy people don't give at all. So if wealthy people want to start a foundation, that's a good thing. But we also have to bring a different lens. This is not about our wealth and building our legacy or my resources, but this is wealth of community. And if we see this money as something that would have gone into the public tax system to support all the things that we collectively need, then maybe we would do our philanthropy in a different way. Or maybe we would pay for campaigns to raise taxes on the rich. I don't know, right?
There's a question right here.
Thanks. Thank you so much. I don't know if any of you attended the not-for-profit summit last week, but while I was there, I heard a woman who, at the roundtable, the funders roundtable, gave an impassioned argument that the foundations, quite frankly, are setting them up for failure because they're not giving enough money. And I was a little incensed by her because I thought, be grateful for what you get. And then I heard you, and I thought to myself, maybe there's a different look to this. So I want to thank you for opening my eyes up. The second thing I want to ask, though, is if we just turn over the capital, and she made an argument that you're giving me $20,000 for something that costs a lot more to do, and I want to do more. If we turn over the capital without allowing people the sense of it's okay to fail, with our environment where racism is so embedded, are we not then setting people up to say, yeah, you couldn't cut it? I worry about that, and I don't know how to frame that question other than to say, what do we do to protect people once we give them the money and give them the empowerment to do good things, but it's okay to fail? White people have failed and started over a lot. Are we going to hold people to the same standards?
Yeah, I think I have two thoughts there. One is I am not a major advocate for foundations to go in perpetuity. The argument for foundations to exist forever basically, I think, comes from a very self-centered point of view of like, we need to be here forever because we've got to continue to be the savior to this community. I think that foundations need to question and have real conversations about their need to be around forever versus liquidating those assets and turning them over to the community, because there will be wealth in the future. There will be more wealth in the future. And so why hoard wealth now? Because the rainy day is here. Like, it is the rainy day. And I was really, really thrilled. Like, all these random crazy things have happened because of the book that are like, you guys wouldn't believe. I just keep a little file folder. But there's a $500 million foundation, the Bullitt Foundation in Seattle, where the board read my book and decided to liquidate the foundation and turn all the money over to the community, which I think is like awesome, right? Because they're like, why do we need to be the ones in charge and make all these decisions and be the keepers of the treasure box, right? Let's put this money into the community. They're an environmental foundation. Let's put this money in the community now and trust the community. When I write checks to people, I don't worry about whether or not I think they're gonna do good with the money or whatever. Like, I am just communities of color have been so marginalized resource-wise that it's like, you know what? I'm just going to put the money there, and what happens will happen. I don't need a report, or I don't need to feel like I'm in control of how you spend it. And so I think that's sort of the next layer, like until we liquidate all foundations. I'm not calling for the liquidation of all foundations. But in the meantime, as we're thinking about moving money to these groups, we have to shift our mindset around our expectations of how they perform, right? And so even to say, like, who are we to determine what success is for them, or if it's a failure or not? I think some of that, we have created standards in our minds of what performance should be, that may not be how those groups do work. And I'll tell you this quick example. When I left my first foundation job, I went to run a nonprofit. My only funder was the foundation that I used to work at. Okay, that's I didn't put that in a book, I don't think. Now, and it was a small grant. It was like $60,000, and it was my only. So you can imagine my salary was much less than it was at the foundation. Well, I killed it. I killed that grant. They should have had me on the cover of the annual report. Because, I mean, you talk about results. I mean, I turned that $60,000 into all kind of work. Well, and then the foundation had the nerve to come to me to say they didn't think I had delivered enough impact on that money, and that I could have done X, Y, and Z. And I was like, well, first of all, I used to work there. So I know how you define impact and where the level of my results compared to like the typical grantee there. So how dare you, right? But also, who are you to come into this organization that is an indigenous-led organization, all Native board working in a Native community, and tell us like what we should and should not have done? And so we've got to release that, what some folks call white savior mentality, where we want to give money, but we feel like we have to kind of hold on and like and kind of control the outcome of that. And just blindly beginning to trust communities. And there's a lot of wisdom and resilience and smart folks in these communities that will figure it out.
Wow. That's a form of liberation. Jeremy.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you've seen any difference between community foundations and private foundations.
Yeah, I mean, in short, yes. And I think because community foundations have stakeholders and have to report back out to lots of donors and to the community. I think at times, some, it's kind of like it depends, kind of response, I guess. But I've seen some foundations really step into those leadership roles and take some ownership around these types of community dialogues and provide the space and the container of resources. Because they hold that community sort of view in the work that they do, versus a private foundation that has very little to zero accountability to anybody. Now, there's private foundations that are doing fantastic work because that's just what the board and staff have decided to do. So I don't want to like blanketly, put people in categories. But I think ultimately, transparency is a good thing. Something that, private foundations, only 2 of the 10 largest private foundations put their financial statements on the website. We're so secretive about everything, right? Because we probably have things we're ashamed of. So I really appreciate the role that community foundations play in communities. I think often community foundations too are that first funder and will take that risk on groups and communities and tend to be more diverse, of course at the board level, but also at the staff level. And so those are a few of the differences that I see. Yeah.
We have just time for one question more.
I apologize to those of you who didn't get this last question. It better be great. My question is around this sort of moment of either apology or reconciliation. I'm trying to understand what that looks like from your perspective within the confounds of capitalism, and also what that looks like for those, in the way you've put it, who have been marginalized. Is it this Day of Atonement? Is it a new holiday? In practicality, I'm trying to understand what that would mean, or what that would ultimately result in from an economic perspective. And then tied to that question, if dollars were given to communities is there a specific vehicle that you're suggesting that be given to? Is that a local nonprofit, or is that like to the actual community through new vehicles? Thank you.
Amazing final question.
Yeah.
Thank you. You nailed it. So I think, how would I address that? So reparations is a conversation that's happening now, sort of like main stage. We have political candidates who have included reparations as a part of their platforms, which I am like loving, right? I think this is the conversation that we need to have. And I think in terms of what an economic package policy kind of thing at a large scale could look like, that would be one example, right? You have some local governments who are experimenting with universal basic income and things like that, the mayor of Stockton, California, Michael, who is like awesome, is experimenting with that in Stockton and seeing great results. So there are definitely like larger sweeping types of potential policy things that could get at repairing wrongs that have been done in the past. Where an apology comes in, this is my thing about reparations. I'm all excited about it, but I think if we just pass reparations right now, it will literally be like writing a check, and I think America will wash its hands and say, okay, well, we're done with that. We're in a post-racial society. Don't ever bring slavery up again or whatever, right? And so that's where the apology and the grieving and the apology come in. I mean, personally, I will speak from an indigenous point of view. Some reparation packages include Black and Native folks. I personally, I want the money if it's gonna come about, but I also would prefer, like more important to me than a check would be to really be heard and seen in our history, understood and respected. And I think that is the problem with reparations right now. We haven't done that pre-work, right? We need to really hear the truth and like really listen to folks and really grieve before we jump to apology. Because going back to your analogy, it's like, oh, you did someone wrong, and you're like, okay, I'm sorry, here's some money, and then like you move on, right? No, have you been in a fight with a partner or whoever before? It's like, oh no, like you're gonna hear and understand why I'm mad at you before we move on, right? Like, I don't care that you brought me flowers. We're gonna talk.
You did the dishes, so
like,
what?
Right, you did the dishes, like you gave me something, fine, but you are still gonna understand what has transpired so that we can avoid this situation again in the future. So I think that's what, apology at a large scale could actually be major institutions like the government, like philanthropic institutions, like faith communities, actually taking ownership and saying, we are officially wanting to apologize, and we want to create spaces for people to be heard so that those stories are documented. Because right now, like, it's sort of, it's being erased, as we talked about earlier. I share in the book, I won't tell the whole story now, but I share a story in the book about a woman who wrote a letter of apology to me, a white lady with wealth. Her family got a land grant right in the same community where our family's land was taken, and she owned Black and Native slaves. Her family historically owned slaves there, and now she benefits from all this wealth, and she has a foundation. She did her work, she learned all of that, and she wrote a series of apologies to people, and I'm one of the people who received that letter. Now, from a person of color perspective, because it did lots of good for her, but from a person of color perspective, receiving that letter, it was transformative for me. I didn't even know that, I didn't ask for an apology. I was minding my business, living my life, doing my thing, and I got this random letter out of the blue where this white lady who benefited from the exploitation of my ancestors was acknowledging that and taking ownership and apologizing on behalf of her ancestors and saying, and like list all the things, like the poverty, the violence, all the things that my family is still struggling with. And I had never felt so visible in my life. Because when you're a person of color, and especially if you're one of the tokens like me that made it out of poverty, so to speak, right, we're constantly having to push back on these narratives, right, around the bootstrap mentality. Oh, if these people would just like work hard like you did, or if people would just like study and go to school and not get pregnant or whatever, right, without taking into account that history. So for someone in her position to actually see things for what they were and to like name the historical stuff that my community has been through and then just say, I'm sorry, with no expectation of me responding to her or whatever, I like wept when I read that. Like there was some healing that began to transpire in me to be seen in that way and to hear that from somebody. And I have that letter right there in my bag. I carry it with me everywhere I go because it was just such a powerful example on an individual level of what grieving and apologizing can do between two individuals. And I think that could happen in a broader scale with organizations and even at a national level.
Well, I'm sorry to have to draw this to a conclusion because I think that we're just really getting fired up, but I think the conversation will continue, and I want to thank you for this provocative book, for the seeds it will plant today in our community. Joylette, to you for really tying it to our sustainability and our common future and our ways of moving forward and thinking about healing. You know, if you've been here before, that we like to send our visitors away with an image of a Pittsburgh philanthropist who aligns with their work. And so it was an automatic choice that we would think of Madam C.J. Walker, who was in Pittsburgh for 2 years at the dawn of the 20th century, who was the first African-American millionaire businesswoman, who encouraged her franchisees to get involved in the community and give back, and who went on through her philanthropic life to really champion causes of social justice and civil rights. She had an ongoing, decades-long relationship with Robert Vann, who was the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the voice for African-American experience in this country. And please take this image with you as a sign of our gratitude and also as a reminder of not only Pittsburgh, but your connection and the enduring value of the work both you and she have done in our world. Wow. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it.
That's awesome. Thank you guys. Lovely.
And Joylette, we have something for you that speaks to the natural world, and I'll let you open that at your own pleasure.
Thank you.
But
That's
I
so
want to thank
lovely.
Barb Taylor and the Grant Makers Organization, please, for bringing Edgar to town, Anne-Marie Tockett, Marisa Escajeda, and also Jillian Royal for their help today. The book is outside. Edgar has signed some copies that are for sale. And so I think you might be excited and incited to read more and to carry forth this. And I thank you for being such a great audience. And I ask you to carry on these very issues into our community each and every day. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry we have to get you out of here.
Amazing.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate that.
Truly, truly.